cannot end well, or will not. Charlton. When somebody says it cannot end well, they are usually making a pessimistic prognosis that is probabilistic. They are saying that it is too risky, that the strong likelihood is an adverse outcome. But when it is asserted that something will not end well, this relates to the underlying motivation. If the motivations behind a change are bad or wrong, then whatever happens, which may not be predicted, will not be good, because whatever happens will be expressive of that wrong motivation. That will not end well expressed my interpretation of the past 6 weeks. Whatever bad outcomes ensue are not probabilistic, but a consequence of being built upon wrong motivations. When puppets fight. Charlton. We know for sure that all the Western leaders are puppets. So when the puppets of the USA fight the puppets of European nations, then both puppets are being controlled by the same entity. When the puppeteer makes the puppets fight each other, this is because a fight is a necessary part of the plot, part of the driving narrative. I don't know exactly who is the puppeteer entity, the covert strategic intelligence / controlling the puppets from out with the public gaze. I don't know, and I'm not going to waste my time guessing, because I do know who controls the puppeteer, and that is sufficient. Spiritual effects of World War II, totalitarianism, and dishonesty. Charlton. Huge subject, but I've been reading memoirs and histories of World War II in the past couple of years, and pondering the spiritual effect this 6-year conflict had on the British people, especially. I have known for a while that World War I was the last time there was a significant Christian revival in the UK, in terms of a great increase in interest in higher things as well as full churches and more participation in public activities. This is confirmed by comments by C.S. Lewis and his circle, who noticed the revival and speculated about its meaning and direction. But I have become more aware of the negative effects of the war on British spiritual life. The obvious thing was recorded by Orwell, the qualitative acceleration of totalitarian bureaucracy, which is intrinsically evil, by which I mean, the totalitarian systematization and directing of mankind is evil, and corrupts men, no matter what purpose it is used for. As part of this totalitarianism, the war brought a tremendous increase in systemic dishonesty. It seems that, from top to bottom, the attitude became focused on the predicted behavioral effect of statements, to which an understanding of actual reality would routinely, and indeed compulsorily, be subordinated. I suspect that a great deal of the Christian revival was atavistic, backward-looking, and attempt to recover an irrecoverable earlier stage of human religious consciousness. The revival mostly took the form of a doomed to fail attempt to revive the church-rooted, medieval pre-modern form of top-down and mediated Christianity, and Christian spirituality was linked to this earlier, traditional, social form. After the war, the nation moved forward from its totalitarian, hence atheistic, wartime basis, and this was extended by the merger, bureaucratization, and nationalization of many major industries and social activities. This created a secular public discourse, hence excluded Christianity, and the wartime revival rapidly collapsed. It appears that, in this era of human consciousness, war is always totalitarian, therefore innately hostile to the kind of spirituality that is necessary to Christianity. The sense of a nation or people in unity, self-sacrificing and cooperating on communal projects, working together for a common cause, these are no longer net benefits, but mostly mass psychological manipulations with evil intent behind them. I suspect that it would now be mistaken to expect any large-scale spiritual benefits from war, which may be why so much high-level geopolitical activity is currently focused on escalating and spreading wars. In other words, mass Christianity used to be a benefit of war, but I think that mass Christianity is no longer possible. and the attempt to revive it will instead feed into the evil of totalitarianism. Of course, any individual person may choose to take personal spiritual responsibility, and learn spiritually from whatever his situation, including war. But modern war is extremely hostile to this situation of ultimate beingness. For proof, we need look no further than the sin of dishonesty, and the extent to which systemic misrepresentation, untruthfulness of all kinds, hype, spin, selectivity, distortion, lies, i.e. a focus on shaping mass behavioral responses to information, has become integral to societal functioning. Once you become aware of this lethal defect, and begin to look for it, you will find manipulative dishonesty to be pervasive, not just at the political institutional corporate level, but almost everywhere and continuous among those who contribute to public discourse, including bloggers. Of course, everyone who is part of the systemic dishonesty will publicly justify himself by claiming that it is in a good cause. But unless he recognizes and repents, privately, at least, the innate evil of dishonesty, then he is lost, spiritually speaking. What is reality, and real life? Bruce Charlton. There is a deep confusion as to the nature of reality. People are, much of the time, engaged in distinguishing real life from something else, whether that be virtual, online, life, the memo interactions of bureaucracy, or contrasted with media such as novels, movies or TV. But the reality that is supposed to be contrasted with these unrealities, is unclear. For some people reality means politics, whether international, national or local. Yet politics is very much second-hand, with its facts, concepts and meanings all learned from secondary sources. Political reality is thus a highly theoretical thing. What's more, politics is a miserable, dishonest, manipulative and destructive business. So if politics is real life, well, for most people, you can keep it. It has near zero appeal. For other people, reality is the social life involving the people around them, with all the expectations and duties, the complications of sex and love for themselves and friends, the activities of their workplace, the functional business of living. These are what they mean by real life. Yet this is, in a different way, a mundane business. It has pleasures and pains in various mixtures, but of itself, our social life has neither purpose nor meaning. Social living is just something that happens, won't go away, cannot be avoided. Social life is also experienced, by most people, most of the time, as earthbound and ephemeral, without depth or resonance, just one damned thing after another, and always ending badly. Other examples could be given of the basic, bottom-line unsatisfactoriness of what modern people regard as real life. My point here is that, as most people actually envisage it, reality is much less appealing, much less enjoyable, than the various forms of unreality on offer. However, it is unsatisfactory to know that one is avoiding reality, and pretending that unreality is real. Indeed, this just does not work as a life strategy. We cannot voluntarily become pleasantly deluded and live by those lies we calculatingly tell ourselves. We cannot just believe what we want, just because it makes us feel better. It doesn't work. So those who try to make the choice of unreality, are caught up by the failure of trying to convince themselves of untruth. To live as if simply isn't strong enough to make a basis for existence. Consequently, when real life is hopelessly miserable and unappealing, and when both options of reality and virtuality/unreality are equally hopeless, then despair seems unavoidable. The question of what is real life, what is really real? Such matters are vitally important here and now, because this is something we really need to know. It seems paradoxical, but the most realistic thing that the archetypical modern man can do, is to focus his best attention onto metaphysics. That is, we need to make the basic nature of reality into the main subject of our primary effort. Like it or not, for us modern Westerners, right living depends on our right thinking. We don't do it, but we need to do it. The innate sense of cosmic significance. Bruce Charlton. Young children have an innate sense of the cosmic significance of what they do, and what they think. At such an age, ourselves and our minds are part of a larger group. We may not be exactly aware of it, and we certainly don't know the exact scope of it. It often seems to include not just people, but other animals, nature, gods, spirits, ghosts, but we know that we are connected. This immersion in a group mind is for both good and ill, and is just a fact of life. There is an in-between phase or stage, in which the inner contact is no longer a spontaneous, direct, quasi-telepathic thing, but instead is sought via symbols, language, image, stories, meand to an end, methods by which people get back, partially, temporarily, that childhood state. At this time and place of history, this is mostly or entirely lost. If people do feel connected and part of a large group, then it is not even at second hand, via symbolic communications. The recent and current addiction to mass and social media is not about symbolic contact with a group mind, but about emotions, excitement, distraction, triggering of feelings. The experience is apparently of isolated selves observing a display of phenomena, hoping to be stimulated. But not entirely thus. I think there is always a sense of cosmic significance, of connection, of just being part of something much larger, at back of people's minds, even though not believed in, even in these here and now conditions. Such cosmic intuitions are nowadays publicly mocked and pitied as necessarily immature, deluded, wishful, self-aggrandizing, sad, psychotic. In a word, anyone who harbors or expresses them is insane. And of course, they may be, especially when somebody tries to persuade and argue others into objectively accepting his special importance on a large, even cosmic, scale. Yet, this typically modern way of explaining away anything that might serve as a basis for purpose and meaning in life is altogether typical of our civilization, where is it a core element of the demonic project despair. This nihilism encompasses the whole of science, when science is taken to be a complete picture of life, as well as the workings of the system, its laws, bureaucracy, media, and the rest of it. All public and official aspects of modern life are predicated on there being no cosmic purpose or meaning in our personal existence. The insanity slur is a typical modern value inversion. The opposite is true. The reality is that anyone who does not have a sense of cosmic significance is insane. That is, their thinking is necessarily incoherent. Their behavior can be of personal and immediate significance merely, adding up to nothing whatsoever. I think we should regard intuitive assumptions of cosmic significance as one of those aspects of innate knowledge that were built into us by the Creator, to serve as a necessary basis for everything else. Cosmic significance versus personal worldly significance. Bruce Charlton. The reality-based sense of cosmic significance needs to be distinguished from this worldly, here and now importance, especially in this world where cosmic significance is not just denied but regarded as a literal impossibility. There is a corrupting snare for anyone who discovers the reality of his own spiritual significance, which is in becoming convinced that he can promote the same insights in others if only he had more influence, wealth, status or whatever. The vision arises of parlaying worldly into spiritual success. This is also a problem for genuine feelings of cosmic significance, in that they seem often to lead to worldly grandiosity, such as when the spiritual becomes worldly, when the spiritual leader develops a business, a following, formal disciples, a cult, or even a religion. This was not always a wrong turn, because in the past there was not such a strong distinction between institutional and spiritual reality, but now the institutional is inexorably mundane and powerfully corrupting, as may be observed in all of the Western churches. Cosmic significance and willpower. Bruce Charlton. There is a recurrent spiritual problem in relation to what might be termed willpower. A vast amount of spirituality has been, and is, about study, training, practice, knowledge, technique. All manner of relatively arduous things that need to be acquired as a matter of habit. In some, the spiritual path is seen as one that requires willpower, with the proviso that in some traditions the willpower is supposed to come from the divine, and this divine will merely be channeled by an individual human being. This may be paradoxical in practice, as a selfless, egoless person is somehow supposed to overcome other temptations and idleness, and instead strive continuously at years of arduous spiritual exercises, which are themselves dedicated to expunging his personal will. It seems natural and inevitable, and is indeed true, that our spiritual cosmic significance will have effects on material this worldly affairs. In other words, insofar as we have spiritual experience, and attain spiritual learning, this will benefit the world. But this effect of the spiritual on the material, the effect of the cosmic on the earthly, does not happen in accordance with our personal will. A big mistake, it seems to me, and one that recurs often, is that spiritual people explicitly strive to change the world in accordance with their spiritual insights. What specifically they do varies greatly, but the general point is that the individual spiritual person tries to change the world in accordance with a pre-decided goal. Attainment of this goal then becomes an index against which spiritual power is calibrated. Another way into this matter is via power. Most people want power in some sense, for some reason, but it is pretty foolish to suppose that it would be a good idea if a person's spiritual power was equated with his ability to achieve pre-decided, explicit, worldly plans. On the flip side, it is equally absurd to adopt a view that spiritual power can lead to absolutely anything in this world, including catastrophic outcomes for those we most love and value. Yet the question of what counts as spiritually catastrophic, rather than materially catastrophic, is a necessary one to consider. After all, the powers of spiritual evil dominate this world, especially in the West, and these demons may engineer materially bad outcomes for spiritually good motivated actions, just as they often engineer worldly success, status, wealth and influence for those who serve demonic interests. My conclusion is rather one of understanding than of advice. We, and especially men, inhabit an intellectual environment that grossly overvalues a caricatured Nietzschean version of willpower. We tend to hero worship and wish to emulate examples of people who set ambitious, worldly, goals, and go on to achieve them, by sustained and long-term endeavor against temptation and difficulties. But a closer examination of these persons will reveal that almost all of them are pervasively corrupted, and spiritually malign, such that it seems their efforts have in fact been in an opposite direction to good. Spiritually good persons are rare indeed, but they seem quite different, and much more concerned with learning and experiencing and developing creatively, than with imposing their will upon other people and the world. Mystical experience in 2025. Bruce Charlton. Claims of mystical experience are not popular in our culture. There are bad and good reasons for this. A bad reason is that, in a world without God, purpose or meaning, mystical experiences are always and necessarily false, for example insane, dumb or dishonest, because there is no such thing. A good reason is that those who claim mystical experiences often claim that it has given them knowledge and authority, such that we ought to believe and do whatever the mystic tells us. However, when all is said and done, it seems to me that nothing is more important in life than real mystical experiences. Even when, as usual, these are infrequent and pretty mild or incomplete, nonetheless, they are what it's all about. On the other hand, there does seem to be a strong tendency for many people to deal with their mystical experiences in mistaken and adverse ways, for instance, by trying to persuade other people and convince them that a mystical experience was really real, and true, and really happened. Or to get hung up on explaining the experience in terms of causes, meanings, implications, etc., explanations that tend to get more and more complicated. Yet it is surely valid to seek an understanding of any mystical experience. But for understanding ourselves, primarily. And not in relation to other people, and the world. And in seeking understanding, it seems likely that the real answer is neither complex nor abstract, but something very simple, easy enough for a child to grasp. The beings of this world are neither wholly evil, nor wholly deluded, but always these are mixed with good. Bruce Charlton. The entities of this world, excepting demonic spirits or resurrected angels, are mixed beings, including illusion and evil as well as good. But it is important that they have good in them. It is impossible for a being to survive in this world without some good, by which I mean, something that is aligned with the purposes and nature of divine creation. If there was any such being that wholly excluded good, it would die, and presumably become a demon. Likewise, all beings in the world are subject to illusion, which is the partial but wrong insight of Maya that this world is of its nature and wholly a delusion, that is to say absolutely false, and we convinced that falsity is true, because this world is, in many respects, deceptive, and we are limited and flawed beings. However, no being is wholly deluded, else he would not survive more than a few moments. The assumption that this is a mixed world includes that all beings are mixed beings, which is a hopeful reality, because it means that there is some good, and some apprehension of reality, in every being. This doesn't really have any implications for our everyday conduct, since we must deal with the realities of evil and error, despite their ultimate self-curability. But it does mean that there is always grounds for hope with respect to any being, any person, in an ultimate sense. We can't ever be sure that anyone has irrevocably chosen self-damnation, that necessary goodness which is mixed into them, means they have the potential to make that choice for God, divine creation, the good, and to follow Jesus Christ to heaven. Christianity and Paganism. William Wildblood. There are two sorts of Christians. Those who completely reject paganism, and those who retain some admiration and even love for it. There are those for whom pagans are either primitives or demon worshippers, and then there are those who see Christ as the fulfillment of the best of pagan vision, and who adopt Christianity as the seal and consummation of paganism. I am of the second sort. Obviously, many pagan beliefs and practices were primitive and many were derived from demon worship, but not all by any means. Paganism was how God, or, more usually, his lieutenants, the gods, spoke to humanity in times past. While there is no doubt that paganism has been superseded by the advent of Christ, this is more in the nature of a religious upgrade than an outright replacement, meaning that virtues of paganism were real virtues, not vices all along. Insofar as pagans believed in one supreme principle and an order to creation, in that they acknowledged higher worlds and even had means to interact with those worlds, they followed a true and good religion. It may have been limited, but it was not entirely false in the context of its time and place. Christians sometimes put all pagans in the same bracket, but that is a mistake. There is nature worship paganism, and then there is that of the philosophers. Certainly, there is crossover between the two, but they are very different. Leaving the philosophers aside, who anyway are often accepted as proto-Christians and who even influenced Christian theology, there is still some spiritual goodness to be gained from paganism as long as we baptize it. One of the reasons the stories of C.S. Lewis and Tolkien are so loved is that they did precisely this. Lewis overtly, Tolkien more discreetly, but both of them reintroduced pagan elements to a basically Christian world, and in so doing brought something back to a Christianity that had not just lost touch with the supernatural but also reduced creation to a dead thing. Paganism regards creation as holy. This is often confused with pantheism, and can descend into that, but really it is the understanding that God has not departed from this world to a far-off place we may or may not access when we are dead. He is ever present, either directly or through his agents. Every tree, every stream, every mountain contains divine life, and paganism knows this while Christianity has largely forgotten it. Various elements go to make up pagan religion, some bad but some good, and the best of them show an understanding of the spiritual world, respect for the Creator and knowledge of his ways. The Celtic saints were Christians, but many of them retained aspects of their pagan beliefs while submitting these to Christian rule. Their pagan-derived love of creation is the reason we find them so appealing today. Having made these points, I should add a proviso. Paganism is of the past and cannot be revived other than in an artificial form. We are modern people with a modern consciousness and sensibility. Our world is not the pagan world, and we have come too far ever to make it so. We can be inspired by the past, but we cannot go back to it, and the attempt to do so will only result in pretense and a disconnect between head and heart. In these end times all manner of past beliefs rise up to the surface, but they do so in a form largely drained of spiritual vitality. That is true of paganism and, in fact, it is becoming true of official Christianity too, which is why the contemporary disciple usually has to make his own way in the spiritual world. While making that way, he is at liberty to be inspired by the pagan love for and knowledge of the energies of creation, so long as he understands these to be subordinate to the Creator, who sent his Son to the world to reveal his true face and form. Destroying enchantment in the arts. Bruce Charlton. Ever since I became self-aware in my mid-teens, I have valued enchantment, that magical quality of what I might now call participation, which is depth and breadth, significance and beauty. Enchantment is the same thing that C.S. Lewis called joy, and Novalis called Sehnsucht, and was something of an obsession for the Romantic movement. I found it first in Tolkien, and realized quickly how rare it was, and how it was altogether absent from most of what most people valued and praised. Furthermore, there didn't seem to be anybody else who valued it as I did, rather, more exactly, there were differences of opinion as to where it might be found, even among those who did value it. Finding it was therefore something of a personal quest, and I began to realize that even when I located a source of enchantment, the trend of our times was working against it. I found enchantment in the work of the electric folk group Steel Eye Span, especially in their supernatural and magical ballads. But after 7 LPs of reliably enchanting music, I noticed that in 1975 All Around My Hat was a considerable step down in this respect. It was something to do with a feeling of overproduction in the music, which was apparently intended to make it more commercial, more instantly appealing to a mass audience, and this being achieved by what seemed like excessive messing around with sound and arrangements and, presumably, performance, excessive production control, such that the delicate bloom of the songs was somewhat rubbed off. The following album, Rocket Cottage, was poor, and then the band broke up. The thing about enchantment is that it isn't usually a conscious goal, but happens as a byproduct, as a part of a larger and spontaneously integrated activity. Indeed, it is not possible to get enchantment by making it primary, as C.S. Lewis describes and explains in Surprised by Joy. But enchantment can be prevented or destroyed by any focus on almost any specific, it can be pulled down, but also killed by breaking up. So, whereas I quite often found an almost accidental enchantment in many amateur plays and music, I only seldom found it in the work of professionals, especially when they were required to repeat performances, and these became routine. I have never seen a play with enchantment in the West End London theatre, for instance, where actors do long runs of the same play. Routine is a killer of enchantment, as is management, mugging, exaggeration for effect, as when performers show off, more generally are striving for entertainment, shocks, horror, laughs. A political agenda dominating is maybe the commonest cause of deadly disenchantment. Politics is one of the most disenchanted of all domains. Any priority, that is, which arises from outside, and imposes onto the creative process, and interaction. The death of enchantment is a product of separation. Modernity takes an original unity, analyzes it into components, treats it as a collection of attributes, and then pursues these singly, perhaps in sequence, or emphasizes on or a few at the expense of the whole. I have even come across modern attempts, some genuine, others probably insincere, to make enchantment itself an externally imposed priority, to layer it onto works or an intrinsically anti-enchantment aspect of life, such as politics, bureaucracy, mass media, or corporate life, as if it was some kind of source. This never works, but achieves the opposite. Enchantment is either integral to the creative process, to life, or else it is absent. Now, although enchantment is still discerned and valued by a few people, and can still be found and still arises, but almost exclusively out with professional and official sources, our civilization lies on the far side from it. The nature and trend of our whole world is systematically and pervasively hostile to enchantment. This is apparently what I sensed 50 years ago, back in 1975, although I didn't realize how far the process had yet to go. And, as usual, we can't go back. The future of enchantment in the arts, or anywhere, must be something essentially unprecedented, because it can only arise from the large perspective of a lived enchanted life, more exactly from that part or aspect of a man's life which is enchanted. Note, exactly the same problem of disenchantment happens in churches, and over much the same time scale. There is near zero enchantment in church services, or in any aspect of church life. Even when the Christianity is sincere, the atmosphere is as mundane as an office. And probably a majority of serious modern Christians have set their face against many of the manifestations of enchantment, which they reject vehemently as demonic. The truth is the opposite. Enchantment is a manifestation of the divine, is indeed heavenly, and the hope of resurrection. Whatever its intent, mundane Christianity does the work of Satan, quite literally. Jesus Christ and the ongoing second creation, reason for a personal relationship with Jesus during this mortal life. Bruce Charlton. I have been blogging recently about the idea that Jesus' cosmic role was the second creation, that is heaven. Jesus made possible resurrected eternal life, and therefore heaven. But, in addition, Jesus has a role as the Good Shepherd, who will lead each of us to heaven, if we choose to follow him from love. One part of this leading is for Jesus to show the way and make possible our transformation from mortal to immortal, that is resurrection. Another aspect is that Jesus, who is the Holy Ghost, can, if voluntarily sought, provide guidance, comfort and positive encouragement, on a moment-by-moment basis, during this mortal life on earth. This guidance/comfort/encouragement from the Holy Ghost may come via prayer, in other words, by prayers addressed to Jesus. Or it may come by any other manifestation of a loving friendship with Jesus, such as in meditation, or by directing our thoughts and attention to Jesus at any time or place or situation. It's not that I regard prayers and thoughts directed at God the primary creator as a wrong thing to do, but it seems to me that these are not specifically Christian. A Christian should, surely, be focused on Christ. And that includes prayer, meditation, and our best kind of thinking. The purpose of this mortal life can be conceptualized negatively and positively. Negatively, there is the matter of learning from problems and mistakes, from disease and death, repenting sins, and the like. But a positive and strongly motivating life goal is essential in these adverse times, and this motivation, because of the corruption of churches, along with other institutions, to the side of evil, must be something that arises from and works at the individual personal level. In the first place, it seems evident, from our own setup and the way the world now is, that this motivating purpose is something we need to work out for ourselves, consciously and by active choice. This needs to come primarily from our intuition, which means from our real and eternal self. But this inner source is, of course, prone to error and self-deception, and that leads to the special role of the Holy Ghost. I think that, in general, there are exceptions. The role of the Holy Ghost is not to provide primary guidance, not to tell us what to do. But instead the Holy Ghost is meant to serve as a check and confirmation on what we have personally discerned and worked out. As a mega simplification, first we decide what we ought to do, then we consult with the Holy Ghost that we have got it right, that this is indeed what we ought to do. So far, we are still in the double negative territory. However, the positive role of the Holy Ghost is then in the comfort and encouragement, the energizing and enthusing, deriving from knowing that we are indeed personally, and in these exact circumstances, doing the right thing. AI and Schadenfreude. Bruce Charlton. One of the multi-pronged and actively corrupting effects of the current global establishment push of so-called text and image generating AI is its encouragement, if encouragement were needed, of that besetting sin of this time, Schadenfreude. I have come across many online binges of spiteful, almost erotic, glee, when people imagine the devastating effect that AI will supposedly have on destroying the livelihoods of journalists, illustrators, scriptwriters, novelists, and in general those involved in the visual and verbal aspects of mainstream media and public relations. Nearly all of whom enthusiastically put their talents in service to the agenda of value corruption, and who appear to be 101% on board with the demonic program of totalitarianism. The orgies of delight at what is hoped will be the deserved sufferings of these myrmidons of Satan, is a certain evil in its own right. Which evil has nothing to do with the fact that most of these people are apparently on the wrong side in the spiritual war of this world. The idea that those destroyed deserve their sufferings, and that therefore it is right to take pleasure in their misery, is just one of those deadly rationalizations that prevent sin from being repented. Therefore, the evil I describe comes from resentment, not repented but instead actively celebrated, and rhetorically intended to induce celebration in others. Of course, this is only a small aspect of the many evils that AI is planned to wreak upon the human spirit, yet it is a calculated consequence of the strategy of implementation, and deserves at least cursory acknowledgement. Necessary for existence in creation. Sure. For being/existence. Not so much. Francis Berger. The line of thinking that posits that God can only be God if he is necessary is both correct and sorely off the mark. The first creation could not exist without God. In this sense, God is necessary for first creation. First creation could not exist if God did not create it and help maintain it. However, the first creation is not a product of nothing. The beings that inhabit the first creation existed in some form before the first creation. God is necessary for their existence as beings in the first creation, but God is not necessary for their existence before the first creation. In this sense, God is entirely, fundamentally unnecessary in the strict, core denotion of the word. The beings that comprise the first creation would have gone on existing in whatever form or mode they existed without God's intervention. The pre-first creation mode of existence was obviously deficient/lacking, thus, God's first creation is a positive development. However, it is misleading to say that this positive development was absolutely necessary. The same applies to Jesus and his second creation. Although Jesus is necessary for the creation of heaven, it would be wrong to claim that following Jesus into heaven is absolutely necessary. The weird delusions of geopolitics, to which we are nearly all prone, nearly all of the time. Bruce Charlton. If you can imagine yourself to be a human from another planet who had arrived to observe the denizens of the Western civilization on Earth, I think you would be amazed at the amount of mental time and effort that we expend on having strong opinions on geopolitical matters. So much of our public discourse is occupied by political and social issues, national and international, which are remote, second-hand, to put it kindly, and over which we can have no conceivable influence. It is a spell cast over almost all of us, and from which we only seldom and briefly awake to be astonished at ourselves. Before lapsing back into the bizarre world view in which my opinion on something geopolitical is supposed to be crucially important, both to the world and to my own identity and moral status. What is strangest of all, is the inbuilt expectation that, not only must we all have the right understanding of everything, but also we are each supposed to have some sort of plan or blueprint for fixing the world. Indeed, the expectation is that we are not really entitled to an opinion unless we also have a plan to fix it. Not only are we required to consider all the questions, but we are expected to know all the answers. Not only should we have a plan to fix everything, but we ought to be doing something about fixing it. That something may, objectively, be of ludicrously trivial, like participating in an election every few years, but it is nonetheless believed to be morally mandatory, and causally linked to all that happens in the world. We are defined by that microscopic act, defined, I mean, in our own minds. More exactly, we must subscribe to, subordinate ourselves to, be loyal to, some kind of ideology, if not religion, that claims to be coherent and comprehensive, to have all the answers to all the questions, because any gap in the queues or as is supposed be a fatal deficit. That loyalty is, supposedly, what makes us a responsible human being. And if our ideology doesn't have a viewpoint on everything that happens to be in the news today, then it's no good, and we ought to change it. I do not exempt myself from membership of this obviously delusory way of living, it's just that very occasionally, such as the past few minutes, my mind clears of the smoke, I come to my senses, and realize my insanity. Before lapsing back into the morass. The spiritual failure of all objective systems, including institutions and corporations, including churches. Bruce Charlton. What we have witnessed over the past century is the failure of each and all systems to be sufficiently spiritual, that they can avoid the gravitational pull of corruption by totalitarianism, which is intrinsically evil. In other words, all systems, which include all churches, and every other kind of spiritual organization, such as Rudolf Steiner's Anthroposophical Society, have become detached from the individual and personal sources which were their only link with the spiritual. In making religion or spirituality into a system, the essence has been made objective, social, public, and therefore they have been corrupted. This did not necessarily happen in the more remote past, because individual humans who operated within systems were spontaneously, often unconsciously, spiritual beings, that is, people just were in touch with the world of spirit, gods, the dead, the supernatural, the magical etc. This inevitably had a spiritually leavening effect upon even the most rational, mathematical, objective kind of system. Another aspect was that people were spontaneously and necessarily group-ish in their consciousness and behavior. But as people became more fully modern, which is to say alienated, cut off from the world of spirit, and from human groups, they ceased to leaven the objective structures of institutions with an unconscious spirituality, and the institutions became objective, on the surface, public, bureaucratic, in their essence. The individual human had to conform to the system, subordinate to it, obey it, in a one-way fashion, and thus totalitarianism was born. Now, from here and now, there is no hope in systems, including no hope in any possible or conceivable church or spiritual organization, because these are now objective social structures in their essence. Detached, alienated, cut off from the spiritual. Their structure and processes exclude the spiritual. That is why all systems, institutions, organizations etc. have become assimilated to totalitarianism. It is impossible that they would not be, because they cannot be anything else. To put it another way, as of 2025, there is no system that can, of itself, lead to positive spiritual results, and the stronger and more comprehensive is the system, the more spiritual harm it will be doing. Note added, if you are one of those who manage to convince yourself that yes, this is true. All systems are indeed assimilated to totalitarianism for everyone. But not for my church. Then I would say, think again just how much discernment, evaluation and selectivity you have to apply to your church in order to be able to deny that it is fundamentally corrupted. Just how much of your church you must in fact ignore in order to regard it as essentially true. And consider that the amount of discernment, evaluation, selectivity and ignoring that you must apply is continually increasing. Fear of the dark. William Wildblood. Few of us know real darkness nowadays. Unless you live deep in the countryside, you will probably have some buildings nearby that keep their outside lights on all night. Business premises have been like this for some time, but now many private properties do it as well, presumably for security reasons. I remember as a child waking up in the night and not being able to see my hand in front of my face. There's no chance of that where I live today, as there's always some light coming in through the curtains, some from lights on a neighboring property, but also a great deal from the night sky itself, which reflects back light from the earth, from street lights and lights left on all night on the exteriors of buildings, both private and commercial. It's insane. We evolved to need darkness to have proper sleep. Without darkness, our sleep is more easily disturbed and more likely to be shallow, and this means our waking life will be lived more on the surface too, because our minds have not engaged with deeper levels at night. The constant noise we put up with is a contributing factor to that as well, but the lack of darkness in our lives means we live in an increasingly artificial state. Darkness helps us to go inwards. It takes us away from the distractions of life and the excessive stimulation of the modern world. Too much stimulation makes us live on edge, on the outside of things, caught up in the endless movement of material life, and unable to find true rest and restoration, which can only be known in stillness and silence, and in the deep darkness that is conducive to peace. Darkness is a friend we no longer wish to know. We can do this because of electricity. It's no coincidence that the discovery and exploitation of electricity has accompanied the rise and growth of materialism. The two are clearly linked, and not just because electricity has powered the modern world. If we ask where electricity comes from, we find that it has its origin in the world of subnature, and what comes from that world partakes of that world and carries the influence of that world. Jeremy Nadler wrote an interesting book about the prehistory of the computer called In the Shadow of the Machine, in which he examines this question of electricity. He concludes with Rudolf Steiner that it is a form of degraded light which might mimic light but lacks its spiritual qualities because it comes from what we might justifiably call the nether regions. Our reliance on electricity and addiction to its use will affect our consciousness, which will also has become, degraded and desensitized. This is because what we use imparts its qualities to our minds. We enter its world and become part of that world. Our injudicious and excessive use of electricity is taking us out of the world of nature, never mind the spiritual world, and into the underworld, which is where electricity comes from. This is obviously all part of the end times scenario, and we can't escape it unless we trek off into the wilderness, which is not feasible for most of us and may have its own problems for souls who have elected to live now. What we can do is become aware of the problem. We may have to use electricity to live in the world of the present time, but we can be sparing in our use of it, and not allow ourselves to become caught up in the products it powers, which will inevitably have a despiritualizing effect on us. Electricity is not just material as opposed to spiritual. It derives from a place below the natural world, which is our proper earthly home. Who does not feel a greater sense of emotional well-being in a room lit by candlelight or even gas than one with electric light? We may have found a great source of energy, but it demands something of us, and what it demands is of a spiritual nature. Symbolically, darkness is ignorance and death, and light is knowledge and life. But there is also good darkness and bad light, and we must know the difference. The poor always ye have with you, Jesus' harsh rejection of double negative theology. Bruce Charlton.
John 12:3-8. Then took Mary a pound of ointment of spikenard, very costly, and anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the odor of the ointment. Then saith one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, which should betray him, Why was not this ointment sold for 300 pence, and given to the poor? This he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief, and had the bag, and bare what was put therein. Then said Jesus, Let her alone, against the day of my burying hath she kept this. For the poor always ye have with you, but me ye have not always.
Jesus is both impatient and decisive in his rejection of Judas Iscariot's attempt to impose the deadly trap of double negative theology on Jesus' message. The danger of this demonic lure is evident. If Christianity becomes primarily a matter of dealing with the sufferings of this world, there will be no end or limit to such activities, such a mindset. To live for compassion is unchristian and spiritually lethal, because it excludes the ultimate life purpose of salvation. The poor of one sort or another, including our poor selves, our own sufferings and needs, will always be with us, their needs will always be present, and, unless a higher and positive life purpose is in place and dominant, will always usurp the purpose of salvation, as the present self-identified Christian churches exemplify with such horrible clarity. Only from the primacy of a commitment to following Jesus Christ through death to heavenly resurrection, is it spiritually virtuous to consider the endless, boundless, intractable problems of this mortal life and world. And then only from personal love, because abstract, universal, unconditional love is another net to catch the devil's prey. Make no mistake about it, we are talking about a satanic snare. To live double negatively in order to alleviate the ills of this mortal life is evil. Even more evil is to advocate this, to push an altruistic ideology. Jesus' harsh, aggressive, repulsion of Judas's concern for the poor should help make this evident. That it was not just Judas's hypocritical motivation for helping the poor that Jesus was rejecting, is evidenced by the larger scope of Jesus's explanation. That promiscuous altruism, and alleviation of the ills of this world is indeed a devilish trap, lure and snare, is indirectly suggested by the way in which not Christians and anti-Christians are so addicted to making accusations of an un-Christian attitude, if or when any Christian person or institution fails to lend public support to a socio-political scheme that presents itself as intended to alleviate some species of suffering. The literal impossibility of putting theory into practice in life. Bruce Charlton. Theory is always and necessarily a simplified model of reality. Extremely simplified, because everything in the universe is left out, except what is specifically included in the theory. If you think about it, this must be the case, the vastness and unboundedness of life, which is not really divided spatio-temporally, except into beings, otherwise there would be no point in having a theory. A good theory renders graspable the most significant aspects, for the current purpose, of that vastly interconnected web of communication and interaction which is everything. This is why even the very best theories can never be put into practice. It explains why we always come up against the intractable problem of actually living by our understanding of God, creation and salvation. And, in Christianity, even the truest and realest and most good theology cannot be put into practice in life. Life is just so much greater than any theory. When we try, and many have tried, to implement theoretical understanding, to live by the book, the rules or whatever, then it will fail. This does not mean that theory is worthless, yet it never is the truth. It does not mean that theory is useless in some particular practice, yet theory should never be a blueprint. For instance, even the most perfect system of law is unjust, unless interpreted by a good and wise judge, who takes into account the many ways in which the law fails to describe reality. However, we cannot just dispense with theorizing, because we live inside theory. Indeed, we live inside totalitarianism, which is a theory of everything, that denies any limitation, which tends always to encroach everywhere. This is because totalitarianism is rooted in negation, in the double negative values of a theory being against itself, a self-consuming, self-destroying theory of all. Our problem is to escape from the habitual thinking of the inculcated self-tyranny of this system, which theory we actually accept by socialization, because the totalitarian theory dominates public discourse, and we are compelled to live by it in most, and ever more, areas of life. So one value of theorizing is if it helps us break free from the mind control of the actual and evil theory under which we live. But whatever alternative theory we discover or devise, even the best imaginable theory of Christianity, we shall come up against the necessary fact that our theory is ultimately wrong because grossly incomplete, and cannot, as well as should not, be implemented as a blueprint for life and living. The ultimate goal is perhaps always to go beyond theory to live in freedom in accordance with divine creation, not by theory but by intuition, divine inspiration, by knowing reality. In the meanwhile, in this mortal life on earth, we must continue to use theories, but should strive not be used by theories. Change and changelessness, the oldest philosophical problem. Bruce Charlton. The earliest recorded, pre-Socratic, ancient Greek philosophers were metaphysicians who seem to have been focused on explaining change and changelessness, which was the most fundamental, and or how the two were related and interacted. Since change is so obvious, why did they feel a need to impute or explain changelessness? The answer is that if all is change, then there can be no purpose, meaning, knowledge, no values, just a kind of chaos. And then one needs to explain why we spontaneously and tenaciously assume that there are such things as purpose, meaning, etc. In sum, there is explanatory need for something other than change. If we are to have purpose, meaning, values, there would need to be a sense in which there is both directional change and eternal preservation in reality. For Christians, in particular, there must be a way of understanding how eternal good is possible when there is change. When we start, as I do, with the assumption of beings as the units of eternal reality, we need to explain how beings, which are alive and conscious, hence dynamic and exist in time, can both change purposively and also eternally preserve that which is good. If beings must both change and retain, this implies the expansion of beings, because beings must accumulate as well as change. And if this is to be eternal, beings must be expansible without limit. 'Tis is easily understandable by the analogy of development, that is, the development of an organism, for example an animal, from its formation by fertilization through to mature adulthood. Such a process of development includes both directional change and is also cumulative. For instance, in an animal there is innate or instinctive behavior which is given, and there is also learning added to, and interacting with, the instinctive, and learning must be retained, and accumulates. All that we need to add to the analogy is that the organism, or being, potentially is able to continue this development without limit, and everlastingly. That cannot happen during mortal life on this earth, but it is, I believe, what happens in heaven, when we are resurrected eternally. I get this mostly from F.C. Copleston's History of Philosophy, reinforced by Rudolf Steiner's Riddles of Philosophy. Biggles Learns to Fly, Revisited. Bruce Charlton. About 4 years ago, I picked up secondhand a few of the first published Biggles books, by Johns, which triggered a serious revival of interest in World War I, then World War II, military aircraft. Since then, I have read many scores of memoirs and histories, and watched movies and documentaries by the dozens. Going back to reread what began it all, I find that, in particular, Biggles Learns to Fly holds up very well indeed, in terms of being an accurate account of actual experiences of the World War I pilots. Naturally, since the books were aimed at boys, there is more concentrated adventure and humor. But everything described is based on reality, gathered from numerous sources, personal experience, discussion with colleagues, and published accounts. The style and stories are also enjoyable, and emotionally powerful. Stresses, horrors and deaths are there in proportion, and given proper weight. Yet the essential heroism, and chivalry of the pioneer pilots is dominant, as is right and proper. Benefit of the doubt. Supporting net evil. Bruce Charlton. A lot of self-identified Christians believe that it is right and Christian to give institutions and powerful persons the benefit of the doubt when they claim good motivations, or even when they espouse bad intentions. This is assumed to be good in principle or at least harmless. Not so, because when an institution is corrupt, untruthful, net evil, then to fail to discern such reality, to support it, is to join with the side that opposes God, divine creation, and the good, and thereby oneself to become spiritually corrupted. Surely we ought to support good, not evil. How can it be right to lend spiritual, maybe material, aid to Satan? Why not set aside manipulative and self-annihilating propaganda that tends to damnation? We should instead discern, and keep learning, and when we err, we should repent.